Inside a dimly lit 1945. Inside a dimly lit command trailer in Zandhoven, Belgium, the air hangs heavy with dampness, wool, and cigarette smoke. Beyond these walls, the brutal battle of the Bulge is finally beginning to wind down, leaving snow blackened with the stains of war. But Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery isn't studying battle maps or reviewing casualty reports. No, he's focused intently on a typewriter, his fingers moving with deadly precision. Click, clack, click. The words appearing before him aren't orders to strike the Germans. There's something far more dangerous. A calculated attack on his own commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower. This secret telegram, meant only for British High Command in London, represents the ultimate betrayal in coalition warfare. Montgomery doesn't just question American strategy. He assaults the character of American soldiers themselves. He calls the men bleeding in the Ardennes brave, but useless. He describes the entire U.S. command structure as a complete shambles. Montgomery believes this message will secure his path to supreme power. The moment he finally wrests control from the Americans, he seals the envelope, convinced his political maneuvering will remain invisible. He couldn't be more wrong. This telegram isn't merely a complaint. It's a lit fuse about to detonate the entire Allied alliance. To understand why a British field marshal would stab his American allies in the back while the war still raged, we need to look beyond the propaganda footage of smiling generals shaking hands. The so-called special relationship between the United States and Britain in 1944 was actually a toxic marriage, held together only by a common enemy. On one side stood Dwight D. Eisenhower, the master coordinator. Ike wasn't a tactical genius. He was a manager of enormous egos. He held the coalition together through endless patience, chain-smoking 4 packs of cigarettes daily, while mediating disputes between generals who despised each other more than they hated the Nazis. He represented the emerging American superpower, industrial, democratic, and overwhelmingly powerful. On the other side was Bernard Montgomery. Monty, the hero of El Alamein, the man who defeated Rommel. He was brilliant, meticulous, and insufferably arrogant. He represented a fading British Empire, desperate to maintain prestige in a war it could no longer afford to wage alone. Montgomery didn't see Eisenhower as his superior. He saw him as a pleasant administrator who should handle logistics, while the real professionals, the British, handled the actual fighting. For months, tension had been building. Montgomery believed the war was dragging on because the Americans were too aggressive, too disorganized, too scattered. He wanted one concentrated thrust into Germany, led naturally by himself. Eisenhower refused. The resentment within Montgomery built like steam in a pressurized boiler, waiting for any crack to explode through. That crack opened in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, when the Germans launched their massive surprise offensive in the Ardennes. In December 1944, the Allied front line shattered. American units were overrun, communications severed, panic spreading through the rear. To Montgomery, this catastrophe wasn't a tragedy, it was vindication. From his northern headquarters, Monty studied the map with smug satisfaction. In his mind, the chaos proved everything he'd been saying all along. The Americans were amateurs, undisciplined cowboys who'd overextended themselves and were now paying the price. He genuinely believed the U.S. Army stood on the verge of total collapse, and that only a steady, professional British hand could save them from annihilation. This was Montgomery's savior complex in full bloom. He didn't see himself as a partner helping a friend. He saw himself as a stern headmaster disciplining unruly schoolboys. He assumed that once he stepped in and cleaned up the mess, the Americans would be grateful, that they'd gladly hand over control of the entire war effort. Blinded by his own ego, Montgomery failed to see the one thing that mattered most, the resilience of the American soldier. And that blindness was about to lead him into the biggest political disaster of the war. The crisis began with a necessary but dangerous decision. On December 19, 1944, German panzer armies had punched a hole 45 miles deep into Allied lines. The bulge had physically severed General Omar Bradley's communications with his northern forces. Eisenhower, looking at pure logistics, made a tactical call. On December 20th, he temporarily transferred command of two entire American armies, the 1st under Courtney Hodges and the 9th under William Simpson, to Montgomery's 21st Army Group. Overnight, Montgomery controlled 200,000 American soldiers and thousands of tanks. Montgomery didn't treat this as a temporary arrangement. He treated it as a hostile takeover. He immediately halted American counterattacks. He reorganized lines with agonizing slowness, refusing to move until every unit was perfectly positioned. While the 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne, fighting off 7 German divisions and desperately calling for relief, Montgomery held the northern flank completely stationary. He brought in his own British liaison officers, young, arrogant majors who lectured veteran American commanders on basic tactics. He vetoed Bradley's plans to pinch off the bulge at its base. By December 26th, General Patton had broken the siege of Bastogne from the south, moving 3 divisions 100 miles in 48 hours through a blizzard. Yet in the north, Montgomery sat still, tidying up his lines, treating the American armies like toys he refused to share. But his silence on the battlefield was matched by his noise on the telegraph lines. Between December 25, 1944, and January 1, 1945, the telegraph lines between Belgium and London burned with toxicity. Montgomery bypassed the chain of command entirely, writing secret letters to Field Marshal Alan Brooke in London instead of to Eisenhower. In a telegram dated December 27th, Montgomery wrote, "The Americans are in a complete shambles. There is no grip anywhere." He claimed that without him the entire front would have collapsed. He explicitly demanded full operational control of all ground forces, effectively reducing Eisenhower to a figurehead. He didn't stop at military criticism. He attacked the character of the U.S. Army itself. On December 29th, he stated that American troops were brave but useless due to poor training and leadership. He ignored the fact that by this point, the U.S. Army had suffered 75,000 casualties in the Ardennes alone, 19,000 killed in action, holding the line against elite SS Panzer divisions. These telegrams weren't just complaints, they were political dynamite. Montgomery was effectively lobbying the British government to stage a coup against American high command. So confident was he in his assessment that he didn't even bother encrypting some of his messages. He was playing the highest stakes poker imaginable, betting his career against American patience. He was about to go all in with a hand much weaker than he realized. The explosion didn't happen in a secret bunker. It happened in front of the world press. On January 7th, 1945, Montgomery called a press conference at his headquarters. For exactly 30 minutes, he delivered one of the most tone-deaf public relations disasters in military history. In his speech, Montgomery used the word "I" 57 times. He described the Battle of the Bulge not as a desperate defensive stand by American troops, but as a masterpiece of his own generalship. He claimed he had employed the whole available power of the British group of armies to save the Americans. The data proves this was a lie. In reality, British forces engaged mainly in the battle's final stages. The casualty statistics tell the true story. Americans suffered 89,000 casualties in the Bulge. The British suffered 1,400. Yet listening to Montgomery, you'd think he'd single-handedly stopped Hitler's panzers while Americans cowered in the snow. He barely mentioned General Bradley. He didn't mention Patton's heroic relief of Bastogne. He painted a picture of a frantic, disorganized American rabble being rescued by cool, calm British professionals. When the transcript reached General Omar Bradley's headquarters, the usually mild-mannered Bradley turned purple. He slammed his fist against his map board and told his staff he would never take another order from Montgomery again. The secret was out. The insult was public, and the alliance was effectively dead. The news reached Eisenhower's headquarters at Versailles like a physical blow. Ike was a man of infinite compromise, someone who'd swallowed his pride 1,000 times to keep the peace. But reading the transcript and seeing intelligence reports of the secret telegrams to London, something inside him finally snapped. He sat at his desk, cigarette smoke swirling in the cold light. He didn't shout. He didn't throw things. He simply pulled out paper and began drafting a cable. To General George Marshall in Washington, it was an ultimatum. The text was polite, bureaucratic, and absolutely lethal. Eisenhower wrote that he and Montgomery could no longer work together. He stated clearly, "It's him or me." He asked to be relieved of command if Montgomery wasn't removed. This was the nuclear option. Eisenhower knew Washington supplied 70% of the troops and 80% of the supplies in Europe. He knew who Marshall would choose. He was effectively putting a gun to the head of the British Empire and pulling the trigger. Before the cable could be sent, British liaison officer Major General Francis de Goujon saw the draft. He saw the end of everything. He rushed to call the one man who could stop the madness. When Winston Churchill received word of Eisenhower, ultimatum, the blood drained from his face. Churchill was a romantic, but he was also a realist. He looked at the numbers. The British Empire was bankrupt, its manpower reserves exhausted, relying on American lend-lease for everything from tanks to food. If Eisenhower resigned or forced Montgomery's firing, the American public would turn against Britain. The alliance would fracture. Stalin would be the only winner. Churchill realized his spoiled child, Monty, had finally pushed the Americans too far. The adoration he usually held for Montgomery evaporated instantly. This wasn't about military strategy anymore. It was about survival. Churchill dispatched de Goujon back to Montgomery with a simple message. "Ike has a gun to your head, and he's going to pull the trigger. You have 24 hours to apologize, or you're finished." How could a brilliant general like Montgomery be so politically blind? The root cause lay in fundamental differences between British and American ways of war. Montgomery viewed war as a chess game where the grandmaster moves the pieces. He believed rank and experience entitled him to respect. He failed to understand that the American center of gravity wasn't strategy, it was logistics and production. The Americans didn't need a master, they needed a coordinator. Churchill understood this. He knew the era of British dominance was over. In his message to Montgomery, he didn't appeal to friendship. He appealed to cold, hard geopolitical facts. "We're the junior partner now. You cannot insult the man who pays your bills and supplies your tanks." It was a brutal lesson in humility. Montgomery had spent his life believing he was indispensable. Churchill forced him to realize that in the face of American industrial might, no single British general mattered anymore. The scene in Montgomery's caravan that night was pitiful. The arrogant warlord was gone, replaced by a shaken small man. De Goujon stood over him, practically dictating his surrender. Montgomery took his pen and wrote the most difficult letter of his life. "Dear Ike, I am distressed that my press conference has caused you trouble. I would never do anything to hurt you." Then came the line Churchill and de Goujon had forced from him, the full retraction. "Your American soldiers are brave and fighting magnificently. It is an honor to serve beside them." He signed it, "Your very devoted subordinate, Monty." Subordinate. He'd finally admitted it. Eisenhower, reading it the next morning, didn't gloat. He simply took his resignation draft, crumpled it, and threw it away. He replied with a short note. "Thanks, Monty. Let's get on with the war." The crisis was diffused, but the relationship was permanently altered. The apology saved Montgomery's job but killed his influence. From that day forward, Eisenhower stopped listening to London. The strategy shifted decisively. When the time came to cross the Rhine into Germany, Montgomery demanded a grand deliberate operation in the north. Eisenhower allowed it, but he also unleashed Patton and Bradley in the south. While Montgomery spent weeks preparing a massive artillery barrage, Patton quietly slipped his tanks across the river, stealing the glory of being first across the Rhine. The broad front strategy Montgomery hated became the law of the land. American armies raced across Germany, while the British 21st Army Group cleaned up the flanks. By May 1945, the U.S. Army in Europe numbered over 3 million men. The British contribution was dwarfed. The secret telegrams and insults of January had ensured that when victory photos were taken, the Americans would stand in the center and the British to the side. History remembers the Battle of the Bulge for the snow, the shrapnel, and the courage of the 101st Airborne. But the most dangerous moment of that winter didn't happen in a foxhole. It happened in a telegraph office. Winston Churchill's intervention did more than soothe a bruised ego. It saved the Western Alliance from self-destruction. He recognized what Montgomery could not, that in coalition warfare, words can be as lethal as bullets. Montgomery called the Americans useless. History proved him wrong. But it took the threat of being fired and a harsh lesson from his own prime minister to force him to see the truth. In the end, the alliance survived, not because the generals liked each other, but because one man had the power to say enough, and the other had the wisdom to listen. The telegrams were buried in the archives. The war moved on, but the scar remained.